everybody. I'm Brittany Lewis, a breaking news reporter here at Forbes. Joining me now is Dr. J.N. Selzer, pollster and president of Selzer Co. Dr. Selzer, thank you so much for joining me.
It's my pleasure. Thank you.
There is a new Des Moines Register Mediacom Iowa poll that shows the presidential race really narrowing since Vice President Kamala Harris replaced President Joe Biden at the top of the ticket. What are some of your takeaways from this poll?
Well, the first takeaway immediately is that there's a narrow lead for Donald Trump, and we would say narrow compared to what our poll said in June when he held an 18-point lead. So how do you go from an 18-point lead in the course of a couple of months to a 4-point lead? Well, many things have happened since our poll in June, including the debate that Donald Trump had with Joe Biden, which led to him dropping out as the nominee, which led to Kamala Harris ascending to that position. There was an assassination attempt. There were conventions. There is probably not in history a 2-month time that had so many things happen that could influence the outcome of a presidential election. So our first question is, okay, that's a lot of stuff that you put in the blender and mix it all up, and yet we come out with something that is a very clear narrowing, a shrinkage of the lead that Donald Trump had. I decided to try to answer the question of why. And there's really not a large set of people who are not decided, and we see evidence of that in our poll. So sometimes people want to say, well, this race is all about persuading people to change horses in the middle of the stream and go with the other candidate. I don't think this is that kind of race. I think it has to do with identifying people who might not normally vote and working on them to get them to vote, but also I think people in our poll that told us in June the type of person that they were just probably going to vote, might or might not vote, we're going to sit this one out, they don't make it into our likely voters screen. So we picked up fewer people who were likely voters in June than we did in September, when we had a bigger movement and more proportionately more people identifying as likely voters. And guess what? That's not consistent across all demographic groups. It is higher among women, among people under the age of 45, among people with a college degree or more education, and some other groups as well. But each of those is a strong indicator of a vote for Kamala Harris. So there are more of her supporters telling us they will definitely vote. And I think that's the difference.
So in 2 months, a lead from 18 down to a lead of 4, I mean, is that unprecedented as your time as a pollster? I know a lot has changed, most notably the candidate for one, but do you think that that also indicates that Iowa could be in play in November?
I don't know what it indicates going forward. There are many, many things that the campaigns are going to do to try to influence these numbers. So that's a little hard to predict what will happen. Though I've been polling Iowa for a long, long time. So when you say, is it unprecedented? You know, I go back to the first general election that I worked the Iowa poll for when I was on the staff of the Des Moines Register. And we had Michael Dukakis with a big lead in the summer. Don't ask me to recall exactly those numbers, but it was a big lead. And that we weren't the only place that was showing that. And as you know, Michael Dukakis did not end up winning that election. So strange things have happened. But I'm going to say this is the biggest cluster of strange things that I can remember in my lifetime.
Where are you seeing the divide when it comes to gender? I know that you said more women are more excited for Kamala Harris. Can you break down those numbers a little bit more for us?
Well, this election has a sizable gender gap. It is, forgive me while I look at my notes, with men it's 59 to 32, Trump leading. With women it's 53 to 36, with Kamala Harris leading. There are even bigger differences when you look at dads versus moms. It's a relatively small group, but men who have children under the age of 18 go bigger for Trump, and it's a little narrower among moms. So I'm always kind of imagining what's happening in these households where you've got a dad and a mom, and they're yet dividing on the way that they're thinking about the candidates.
Talk to us a little bit more about the undecideds as well as those independent voters. Where have you seen the biggest change from June until now as we sit less than 50 days from Election Day?
Both polls had very low in not sure voters, which is how we say you're undecided. We write you down that way. They're really relatively low. So it's, to me, when I say it's people have got their minds made up, who they support, it's whether they're going to vote. So being more undecided about whether they're going to take the time to go vote, if they're going to sometimes they just leave the top of the ticket blank because they don't like both candidates. I will say one of the things we looked at in June was the double haters. That's become fashionable to call them that, which are people who disliked both candidates. So your Venn diagram, the people in the middle of that. And we were able to say they lean toward Biden in our last poll. In this poll, we don't have enough of them to take a look. So that's significant that you don't have people hating both the way we did just a couple of months ago.
That's really interesting because this whole election season, a lot of my conversations have been, we're voting for the lesser of two evils, if you will, but who's more enthusiastic about their candidate, the supporters of Kamala Harris or the supporters of Donald Trump?
Yeah, it's 80% or more of Kamala Harris supporters who say they are extremely or very enthusiastic. And I think that number is closer to 75, 74% for Donald Trump. So you've got a reversal. We commonly see that Trump supporters, however you measure their level of enthusiasm or engagement, they typically come in, stomping on the other candidate, whoever that might be. And so that's a switch from what we normally see, that it's the Democratic candidate that's generating the enthusiasm.
So people are more enthusiastic about her, but what are their approval ratings like, both Vice President Kamala Harris as well as former President Donald Trump?
The favorability ratings for each of these candidates is nothing to brag about. In both cases, a majority say they feel unfavorable, either very unfavorable or mostly unfavorable. But it's not a huge difference between the two.
And what do we think about RFK Jr.? We know that he dropped out of the race. He threw his endorsement and support behind Donald Trump, but he's going to be on the ballot in Iowa. Is he and his appearance on the ballot going to impact this race, and how significantly so?
Well, all I can do is see what my data kind of tell me. This, again, tea leaves sort of thing. So what I see when I look at the people who say they voted for Trump in 2020, and the people who voted for Biden in 2020, and how they are voting now for RFK Jr., there's very little difference between that group. The bigger group that RFK Jr. is getting is from people who did not vote in 2020. Either they sat it out, or they weren't eligible to vote, or they weren't encouraged to vote for whatever reason. But I don't see this as something that currently, as the data set say today, is something dividing, but no advantage to either candidate.
You told the Des Moines Register that the findings from the poll, quote, signal a change in the mood of the electorate. What is that mood, do you think?
There are a couple of things. Certainly the willingness to say, I will definitely vote. That's how we count you as a likely voter. That number increased says something about an interest greater than what we saw in June. And that certain subgroups, and it's kind of easy to Monday morning quarterback this and say it's the groups that have been most affected by some of the Trump policies that are now saying they're going to show up in greater numbers than we saw in June. So women, you understand, younger people seem more energized, people with more college education, that's typically a more pro-democratic group. And it's just a much bigger showing, women saying that they're going to vote compared to men. So all of those, it sort of is what's going into the pudding here. And it looks like there are more Harris supporters that are jumping into the bowl.
We are less than 50 days from Election Day. Read the tea leaves for us. I know that's what we've been doing this entire conversation, but what are you specifically looking out for next in these next less than 2 months?
Well, I'm going to be looking for things that are outside of the polling world, because if there is, in fact, a greater inclination, attitude, what the parties are going to need to do, what the campaigns are going to need to do, is turn those inclinations into hard votes. So we'll be watching the Get Out the Vote effort, and how many, and that's tracked on a daily basis by the auditor's office, so you can see what's happening in terms of people requesting and turning in absentee ballots, early voting. We'll see signals of that right away. That tends to tilt in favor of Democrats, so there's no sense that it wouldn't be that would lead to a Republican shutout. If we were to see Republicans embracing early voting and absentee voting, I think that would be a real strong sign that the Trump numbers may be ahead of what our polling is showing.
Dr. Selzer, when new numbers from Iowa come out, I hope you come on, join me again to break them down. Thank you so much for your time today.
That's been my pleasure. Thank you.